When the clinic failed the audit, my mother called me and said, "This is all your fault for abandoning the family." I laughed and replied, "Isn't your favorite son the future of this clinic? Now let him fix it." My 9-year secret was finally revealed. 2 weeks later, their clinic went bankrupt and they begged me to come back. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 34 years old, and for almost 9 years, I quietly kept my family's medical clinic alive. Not as a doctor, not as a nurse, not even as an employee. Most people never knew I existed. If you had walked into Brooks' family clinic back then, you would have seen my mother greeting patients at the front desk or my younger brother Ryan walking through the halls talking about his latest expansion plan. You would have assumed they were the ones making everything work. The people who looked the busiest usually weren't the ones holding everything together. I had a full-time job as a healthcare compliance specialist for another organization. It paid well, but almost every evening after work, I'd open another laptop and start working on the clinic. That became my second shift. Before bed, I checked emails from insurance companies, state regulators, and licensing agencies. If something looked urgent, I handled it before I even brushed my teeth. Some nights it took 15 minutes. Other nights it stretched past midnight. Nobody asked how long it took. They just expected it to be done. My weekends weren't much different. While my friends planned hiking trips or brunches, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing compliance reports, correcting billing documentation, or organizing renewal paperwork before another deadline slipped by. One Saturday afternoon, my phone rang while I was grocery shopping. "Nat, it's Carol," one of the clinic receptionists said. "The insurance portal locked us out again." "I'll look at it when I get home." "You always know how to fix it." "I'll call you in an hour." That was normal. Nobody questioned why the receptionist called me instead of Ryan. Ryan, meanwhile, was always chasing the next big idea. One month he wanted a second location. The next month, he was talking about telehealth. After that, it was cosmetic services because, according to him, that's where the real money is. At every family dinner, someone praised his ambition. My mother especially loved listening to him. "Ryan thinks big," she'd say proudly. "He'll take this clinic to another level." Then someone would turn to me. "Natalie, can you make sure the malpractice renewal gets filed this week?" Different conversations, different expectations. I always answered the same way. "Yeah, I'll take care of it." Looking back, I don't think anyone noticed how automatic those words had become. The truth is, I never asked for recognition. I believed family worked that way. If you could help, you helped. You didn't keep score. Technically, I wasn't even part of the clinic. There was no payroll record with my name, no office, no title, no benefits. But if someone looked at the audit preparation, insurance appeals, compliance records, licensing renewals, and regulatory correspondence, my fingerprints were everywhere. My coworkers used to tease me. "You work 2 jobs." "I don't," I'd laugh. "I just help my family." One of them asked, "What happens if you stop helping?" "I won't." It wasn't confidence, it was habit. That evening, I finally sat down for dinner after another long day. I had barely taken 2 bites when my phone buzzed. The caller ID said it was the clinic. "Natalie?" Carol sounded nervous. "I'm so sorry to bother you." "What happened?" "There was an email from the state auditors." I set my fork down. "They're asking for additional documentation." "How much time do we have?" A brief silence. "They're expecting it first thing tomorrow morning." Without another word, I carried my untouched plate into the kitchen, walked to my home office, and opened my laptop. I already knew this wasn't going to be another 15-minute favor. By 8 the next morning, the auditors had everything they requested. Carol called me before I even left for my office. "I don't know how you do it," she said. You saved us again. I laughed. It wasn't magic. Someone just had to organize the paperwork. She thanked me 3 more times before hanging up. By lunchtime, everyone at the clinic had already moved on like the problem had never existed. That was usually how it worked. If something went wrong, I fixed it. If nothing exploded afterward, nobody talked about it again. A few weeks later, Ryan announced another one of his big plans during Sunday dinner. "I've been talking to investors," he said. "We could open a satellite clinic across town." Mom looked at him like he'd just announced he was curing cancer. "That's my boy," Dad nodded. "We have to think bigger if we want to grow." I looked over my plate. Nobody asked where the money would come from. Nobody asked if the clinic's current systems could even support a second location. Those were usually the questions I asked. Ryan pulled out a few colorful presentation pages. There were sketches, projected revenue numbers, and a logo he'd already designed. "It'll pay for itself within 2 years." "That's incredible," Mom said. I quietly noticed half the financial assumptions didn't match the clinic's actual numbers. I almost spoke up. Then Ryan smiled. "I'll figure out the details." Everyone seemed satisfied with that answer. 3 months later, the project quietly disappeared. The investor backed out. Construction never started. The idea simply faded away. Nobody blamed Ryan. Dad shrugged and said, "That's business." Mom smiled at him. "You learn from every setback." Ryan grinned. "I've already got another idea." Everyone laughed. I laughed too. Mostly because nobody seemed bothered that thousands of dollars had been spent on a project that never left the planning stage. Around that same time, my own workload at my full-time job exploded. We were preparing for a major compliance review, and I spent almost every day in meetings. One afternoon, I noticed 3 unread emails from the clinic sitting in my inbox. Normally, I answered within minutes. That day, I couldn't. I finally replied after work, about 4 hours later. Less than 10 minutes passed before my phone rang. It was Mom. "Natalie." "Hey, Mom. I sent those emails this morning." "I know, I've been in meetings all day." There was a short silence. "You used to answer faster?" I blinked. "I was working." "I know you're busy, sweetheart, but the clinic depends on you." I looked around my office. "So does my employer." She sighed like I was missing the point. "I just don't want you losing interest." Losing interest. That stayed with me long after we ended the call. Ryan could spend months chasing projects that never happened. I answered a few emails late because I was doing the job that actually paid my bills. And suddenly, I was the one who wasn't committed enough. A couple of days later, I stopped by the clinic to drop off updated compliance forms. Carol met me near the front desk. "I'm so glad you're here," she said. She lowered her voice. "I don't think we'd survive these inspections without you." Before I could answer, Mom walked out of her office. "There you are," Carol smiled. "I was just telling Natalie how much she helps." Mom gave me a quick smile before turning toward Ryan, who had just walked in. "Your brother's been working so hard on the clinic's future." Ryan nodded modestly. "We're trying." The conversation shifted so naturally that nobody else seemed to notice. Carol glanced at me for a second. She noticed. I simply handed Mom the folder. "Everything's updated. The renewal checklist is inside." She barely looked at it before placing it on her desk. "Perfect. I knew you'd have it handled." "Not thank you. Not great work. Just, of course I did." Driving home that evening, I kept replaying the conversation in my head. It wasn't one moment. It was hundreds of little moments stacked together over the years. Ryan was celebrated for possibilities. I was expected to deliver certainty. One earned applause. The other became invisible because it always happened. If you've ever been the reliable one in your family, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt like your effort became everyone else's expectation. That weekend, Mom started a group chat for Grandma's 70th birthday party. Within minutes, messages filled the screen. Ryan volunteered to give a speech. One cousin offered to bring desserts. Another said she'd handle decorations. Then Mom tagged me. "Natalie, can you organize everything else? You're so good at keeping things together." I stared at the message for a long moment before setting my phone down on the kitchen counter. I didn't answer Mom's message right away. Instead, I made a cup of coffee and stared at my phone while the family group chat kept buzzing. Ryan had already volunteered to give a toast. One cousin offered drinks. Another said she'd make Grandma's favorite pie. Then the messages kept coming. "Natalie will know how to organize it. Just ask Natalie. She always keeps everyone on schedule." Without anyone saying it directly, I'd somehow become the project manager again. I finally typed back, "Sure, I'll put everything together." Mom replied with a heart emoji. That was the closest thing to appreciation I was used to. Over the next 2 weeks, I booked the restaurant, coordinated relatives flying in, arranged the seating chart, confirmed catering, and even reminded Ryan twice to send the photos he wanted for Grandma's slideshow. He forgot both times. I ended up calling one of my aunts instead. The party itself turned out beautifully. Grandma cried when she walked into the room. She hugged every grandchild, laughing as she shared stories none of us had heard before. For a while, everything felt normal. During dinner, people started sharing memories. One uncle thanked Grandma for always putting family first. Another talked about how proud everyone was that the clinic had served the community for decades. Naturally, the conversation shifted to the clinic's future. Ryan didn't waste the opportunity. "We've got a lot of exciting possibilities," he said. He talked confidently about expanding services, bringing in new specialists, and eventually opening another location. Several relatives nodded. "That's impressive. You've really got vision." Ryan smiled. "We're working on it." I noticed he kept saying "we," even though most of the ideas were still just ideas. Then my Aunt Linda looked across the table. "Let's not forget Natalie." She raised her glass. "Someone has to keep all those licenses and regulations straight. You've helped this family more than people probably realize." The room went quiet. I smiled awkwardly. "It's really nothing." Before anyone else could respond, Mom laughed. "Oh, Natalie only has time for all that because she doesn't have the kind of responsibilities Ryan does." A few people chuckled. Ryan carries the pressure of planning the clinic's future. I looked around the table. Nobody corrected her. One cousin even nodded. Ryan leaned back with a grin. "I appreciate everything Natalie does." He paused. "But every business needs leaders." He pointed at me with his fork. "You can't grow a clinic just by organizing paperwork." A couple of relatives laughed. I looked down at my plate. Grandma quietly reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. That tiny gesture was the only sign anyone had noticed. The conversation moved on. People asked Ryan about expansion, about investments, about the future. Nobody mentioned the audits, the insurance appeals, or the compliance deadlines. The invisible work stayed invisible. For years, I thought my family understood what I actually did. Listening to everyone agree with Mom and Ryan, I realized they genuinely believed I was only helping because my life was easier. If you've ever smiled through an awkward family dinner while wanting to say 100 different things, you know how quiet a room can feel. I didn't argue. I helped clean up after dessert. I hugged Grandma goodbye. When I got home, I sat at my desk, opened my laptop like I always did, and stared at the clinic folders waiting on my screen. For several minutes, I didn't touch the keyboard. I sat there until the screen went dark. The clinic folders were still open. The audit calendar, the insurance renewals, the compliance checklist I'd been updating for years. For the first time, I asked myself a question I'd never seriously considered. What would happen if I simply stopped? Not forever. Just stopped acting like every deadline belonged to me. The thought felt uncomfortable, almost selfish. I opened a new email instead of another spreadsheet. The subject line was simple: administrative transition. I kept rewriting the first sentence, deleting it, starting over. Finally, I wrote exactly what I meant. Effective immediately, I would no longer be handling regulatory compliance, licensing, insurance documentation, audits, or any administrative responsibilities for Brooks Family Clinic. I thanked them for letting me help over the years. I offered to transfer any existing files. Then I hit send before I could change my mind. For several minutes, I just stared at my inbox. No dramatic music, no feeling of victory, just silence. Mom called less than 20 minutes later. "Natalie, what is this email?" "It means what it says. You're upset because of dinner." "I'm not upset." "You don't mean this." "I do." She sighed. "Give yourself a few days. You'll feel differently." She wasn't angry. She sounded completely convinced this was temporary, like I'd announced I was taking a weekend off instead of walking away after 9 years. Ryan called that evening. "I heard about your email." "I figured you would." He laughed. "You've earned a break." That surprised me. Then he added, "We'll manage." There wasn't any sarcasm in his voice. He genuinely believed it. "We've got plenty of people here." I wished him luck. That was the entire conversation. Nobody asked why I was leaving. Nobody asked what had pushed me to make that decision. They all seemed focused on one thing, convincing themselves I'd eventually come back. Saturday arrived, and for the first time in years, I had absolutely nothing scheduled for the clinic. I woke up out of habit around 7. My first instinct was to grab my laptop. Instead, I made pancakes. I drank coffee while it was still hot. I finished an entire chapter of a novel that had been sitting on my shelf for months. Around noon, one of my neighbors waved from across the yard. "We're heading to the farmer's market. Wanna come?" Normally, I would have said I was too busy. This time, I smiled. "Yeah, give me 5 minutes." It felt strangely unfamiliar to spend a Saturday without constantly checking my email. I bought fresh peaches, listened to a local band, even forgot where I'd left my phone for almost an hour. I couldn't remember the last time that had happened. Driving home, I caught myself smiling for no particular reason. Then the guilt crept in. I wondered if someone at the clinic was looking for a document, or trying to remember a password, or waiting for me to answer a question. More than once, I reached for my phone, thinking about calling Carol. Each time, I stopped myself. They had my transition files. They had access to everything they needed. Helping one more time would only restart the cycle. Monday morning, I focused on my own job without switching between 2 inboxes every few minutes. By lunchtime, I realized something. I hadn't felt this calm in years. That afternoon, my phone lit up. Brooks Family Clinic. I watched it ring. Then it stopped. A few minutes later, it rang again. Same caller. I picked up my phone and set it back down without answering. The calls didn't stop. They just changed. Instead of my mother or Ryan calling, I started hearing from people who actually worked at the clinic. Carol was the first. "Hey, Nat. Sorry to bother you. What do you need?" "I'm trying to find the insurance appeal template you always used." "It's in the compliance folder under appeals. There should be a file named Master Template." She paused. "There isn't one." "There has to be." "I've looked 3 times." I opened my laptop, more out of curiosity than anything else. The folder was exactly where I remembered it. Then I realized something. Carol didn't have permission to access that section because the folder had always been under my account. "I'll email you a copy," I said. "Thank you." That was it. No logging into their system, no fixing the problem for them, just answering the question. Over the next several weeks, little calls like that became normal. "Where did you save the licensing checklist?" Which insurance contact handled provider enrollment? Do you remember the password policy? Most of the time, I answered in less than a minute. If I didn't know the answer off the top of my head, I simply said so. I had promised myself I wouldn't quietly take my old job back. Keeping that promise turned out to be harder than I expected. Every time my phone rang, I caught myself wanting to solve the entire problem instead of just pointing them in the right direction. Old habits don't disappear overnight. One afternoon, Carol laughed awkwardly. I keep reaching for the phone because I know you'll know the answer. I smiled. You'll figure it out. I hope so. There was a long pause before she added, the clinic feels different without you. I didn't know what to say to that. Life outside the clinic kept moving. Work became less stressful now that I wasn't juggling 2 full-time responsibilities. I started exercising again. I met friends for dinner without bringing my laptop. I even took a weekend trip that I would have canceled a year earlier. Little by little, my own life started feeling like it actually belonged to me. Then small pieces of news about the clinic began finding their way back to me. One former coworker mentioned they'd failed a minor compliance review. It wasn't anything catastrophic, she said, but the inspectors weren't happy. A few weeks later, another employee mentioned a licensing renewal had been submitted late. They approved it eventually, he said, but we almost missed the deadline. None of those problems surprised me. They weren't disasters. They were exactly the kind of issues I used to prevent before anyone else noticed. At another family dinner, Ryan brushed the whole thing aside. The state's making everything more complicated these days. Dad nodded. Too much bureaucracy. Mom sighed. Nothing's simple anymore. I listened quietly. Not one person mentioned planning or preparation, or the fact that deadlines don't move just because paperwork is inconvenient. It was always someone else's fault. The government, the insurance companies, the regulations. Never the people responsible for keeping up with them. For the first time, I understood something I'd never fully appreciated before. The clinic hadn't depended on a single document or a single spreadsheet. It had depended on years of routines that only existed because I'd built them. Things happened automatically because I remembered every deadline, every renewal, every little process nobody else wanted to think about. Knowledge like that isn't easy to replace. One evening, I was grabbing coffee after work when someone called my name. Natalie? I turned around and saw Melissa. She used to work with one of the insurance providers our clinic contracted with. We hadn't seen each other in almost a year. We chatted for a few minutes about work before she frowned slightly. I've actually been meaning to ask you something. Sure. I thought you left the family clinic. I did. She looked genuinely confused. Then, why is your name still listed as the administrative compliance contact on the latest paperwork we received? I felt my smile disappear. What paperwork? Melissa looked just as confused as I felt. I assumed you already knew, she said. I haven't handled anything for the clinic in months. She frowned. Then you should probably ask them about it. I nodded, but my stomach already felt heavy. The drive home was unusually quiet. I kept trying to come up with a simple explanation. Maybe someone had forgotten to update an old contact list. Maybe an insurance company was still using an outdated database. It wouldn't have been the first time paperwork lagged behind reality. By the time I got home, I'd almost convinced myself it was nothing. I opened my laptop anyway. I searched through old emails, resignation letters, and the transition documents I'd saved. Everything was there. The date. The confirmation that I'd transferred my files. The email where I clearly stated I was no longer responsible for compliance or administrative matters. It couldn't have been clearer. The next morning, I called Ryan. He answered on the third ring. Hey, sis. I ran into someone yesterday who said my name is still listed as the clinic's administrative contact. There was a brief pause. Oh, it's probably just old paperwork. So it hasn't been updated? I'm sure somebody forgot. Who? I don't know. His answers came a little too quickly. I'll check when I get a chance. When will that be? Another pause. We've been really busy. He changed the subject before I could ask anything else. So, how's work? That wasn't like him. Normally, Ryan loved explaining every detail of whatever project he was working on. This time, he couldn't end the conversation fast enough. I hung up without getting a single real answer. A couple of days passed. Nothing. No update. No explanation. I finally called Mom. She sounded distracted. Ryan said you were asking about some paperwork. Because people are still seeing my name attached to the clinic. I'm sure it's just a clerical issue. I resigned months ago. I know. Then shouldn't someone fix it? She let out a tired sigh. Natalie, not everything has to become a problem. I didn't answer. She kept going. Ryan has enough on his plate already. I'm not trying to make his life harder. I know you aren't. Her voice softened. But sometimes it's easier to leave little things alone. Little things. That phrase stayed with me. My professional credentials weren't a little thing. If my name appeared on official documents, I could still be connected to decisions I wasn't making. That wasn't about family anymore. That was about responsibility. I started digging a little deeper. Using public records and copies of correspondence I'd kept over the years, I compared dates. At first, everything looked ordinary. Then one document caught my attention. It had been submitted almost 6 weeks after my resignation. My name was listed as the administrative compliance contact. I frowned. Maybe they'd reused an old form. Then I found another. And another. Different dates. Different submissions. All created after I'd already walked away. None of them had my approval. I leaned back in my chair and read through them again. Maybe there was still an innocent explanation. Maybe someone had copied old information without realizing it. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But Ryan's strange answers. Mom telling me to leave it alone. And now multiple documents with fresh submission dates. None of it fit together anymore. For the first time since leaving the clinic, I stopped looking at the situation like a disappointed daughter. I looked at it the way I'd handle any compliance issue at work, with facts, documentation, and a paper trail. One of my coworkers noticed I'd been unusually quiet that afternoon. Everything okay? I hope so. You don't sound very convincing. I gave a small smile. I think I need someone who understands healthcare law better than I do. That evening, I searched for an attorney who specialized in healthcare compliance and professional licensing. I wasn't planning to sue anyone. I wasn't trying to start a family war. I just wanted someone to tell me whether I was worrying over nothing, or whether I had a reason to be worried at all. The attorney didn't rush to any conclusions. That actually made me feel a little better. He listened carefully while I explained everything from the beginning. My years helping the clinic, my resignation, the phone calls, and the documents that still carried my name. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk. I hope this turns out to be nothing, he said. But let's verify the facts before we assume anything. That was exactly what I wanted. Facts. Not family opinions. Not guesses. Just facts. Over the next several days, I forwarded every email, resignation letter, and document I'd kept. Thankfully, I'd always been obsessive about saving records. The attorney smiled when he saw how organized everything was. I wish all my clients kept files like this. For years, organization was my job. I can tell. A week later, he called me back. I've reviewed the documents. And? Some of them appear to have been submitted after your resignation. I know. What concerns me is that they weren't simply old forms sitting in a drawer. He slid several printed copies across the table. These were newly filed. I picked them up. Different dates. Different submission numbers. My name was still listed as the administrative compliance contact. Even my professional credential number appeared exactly where it should. I felt my stomach tighten. Could someone have copied an old template? It's possible. That single sentence gave me hope. I grabbed onto it immediately. So maybe this is just careless paperwork? He nodded slowly. Maybe. Then he added something that changed the room. That's why I requested additional access logs. A few days passed before we met again. This time, his expression was much more serious. He turned his monitor toward me. Take a look at these timestamps. I leaned forward. Every filing had been submitted months after I resigned. Each one required someone to log into the compliance portal. Someone had authenticated the account before sending the documents. I stared at the screen. My account should have been inactive. It should have. So how? I asked the same question. He clicked another document. The account wasn't inactive. I stopped breathing for a second. What do you mean? It was still being used. Not once, not twice, several times, over multiple months. I searched for another explanation. Maybe the system had stayed open. Maybe someone accidentally reused old login information. Maybe. The attorney interrupted my thoughts. We checked that possibility. He opened another report. The login activity came from inside the clinic. I looked at him without saying a word. The IP records are consistent. So whoever accessed the account was working from the clinic. The room suddenly felt much smaller. I remembered every time Mom had told me not to make a big deal out of it. Every time Ryan said they'd been too busy. Every conversation that suddenly ended when I asked questions. I didn't want to connect those dots. I really didn't. The attorney must have noticed the look on my face. You don't have to assume intent yet. I know. Right now, we only know your professional credentials continued to be used without your authorization. Hearing it phrased that way made it sound even worse. Those weren't just forms. That was my professional identity. The license I'd spent years earning. The reputation I'd built throughout my career. Someone had continued using it as if I were still responsible for decisions I knew nothing about. I drove home in complete silence. Several times I reached for my phone, thinking about calling Mom. Or Ryan. Every time, I put it back down. I wanted answers. But I also wanted evidence before anyone had the chance to explain things away. 2 days later, my attorney called again. His voice was calm. We've identified the user who accessed the account. I closed my office door before answering. Who was it? There was a brief pause. Then he quietly said a name I never expected to hear. Ryan. I didn't realize I'd said his name out loud until my attorney nodded. The access logs consistently point to his user activity. I sat there without speaking. Part of me had expected to hear the name of an office manager, maybe an outside consultant, maybe someone who simply didn't know any better. Not my little brother. The attorney let the silence settle before speaking again. We can't say why he did it. But we know he did. He slid another document across the desk. The timestamps matched Ryan's login sessions. The submissions had all been completed while he was working at the clinic. There wasn't much room left for misunderstanding. I drove straight to the clinic. Not because I wanted a fight. Because I wanted one honest conversation. Ryan looked surprised when I walked into his office. Hey, everything okay? I closed the door behind me. Were you using my compliance account? His smile faded. For a second, he didn't answer. Then he leaned back in his chair. It's not as dramatic as you're making it sound. I stared at him. So that's a yes. We just needed to submit a few things. You used my credentials. You weren't using them. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Ryan. That's not how professional licensing works. He rubbed the back of his neck. I figured I'd update everything eventually. You figured? It saved time. Saved time. Those 2 words hit harder than I expected. You never asked me. I knew you'd say no. At least he was honest about that. I took a slow breath. If something in those filings is wrong, my name is attached to it. They're just forms. No. I shook my head. They're legal documents. He rolled his eyes. You always make everything sound more complicated than it is. I looked at him for several seconds. This wasn't arrogance. He truly didn't understand what he'd done, or maybe he didn't want to. Mom walked in before either of us spoke again. I thought I heard your voice. She looked from Ryan to me. What's going on? I handed her copies of the documents. Ryan has been filing paperwork under my professional credentials. She barely glanced at the pages. Is that all? I blinked. Is that all? He was trying to keep the clinic running. By pretending I was still responsible? Mom folded the papers and set them on the desk. Natalie, lowering your voice isn't going to solve anything. I am solving something. No. She looked exhausted. You're creating another crisis. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Someone used my identity without permission. We're family. She said it so naturally, like those 2 words erased every boundary. We weren't trying to hurt you. I don't think you understand. The room went quiet. I pointed at the documents. If regulators investigate those filings, they'll come looking for me first. Ryan shrugged. But nothing happened. Not yet. That single answer finally got his attention. I could see the uncertainty cross his face. For the first time, I don't think he had considered what would happen if someone actually reviewed those records. Mom wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at the clinic through the office window. If this gets reported... She stopped herself. The clinic's reputation could be destroyed. Not, I'm sorry. Not, we were wrong. The first thing she worried about was the business. I suddenly understood why nobody had apologized. From their perspective, the biggest problem wasn't what they'd done. It was the possibility that someone else might find out. I quietly gathered the papers. Ryan finally spoke again. So, what now? I looked at both of them. For years, I'd protected this clinic without asking for anything in return. Now, I had to decide whether protecting it one more time meant sacrificing my own career. My attorney had already explained my options. I could stay silent and hope nothing ever came from those filings. Or I could report the unauthorized use of my professional credentials before someone else discovered it for me. I left the clinic carrying the documents under my arm. By the time I reached my car, I still hadn't decided which choice I could live with. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the same sentence. We're family. For years, those words had been enough to make me ignore my own boundaries. This time, they weren't. I met with my attorney 2 days later. He didn't pressure me either way. My job isn't to tell you what to do, he said. My job is to explain the risk. And the risk is? If regulators discover the unauthorized use before you report it, you'll spend valuable time proving you weren't involved. I already knew my answer before he finished. I need to report it. He gave a small nod. I think that's the right decision professionally. Professionally. That word mattered. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about protecting the career I'd spent more than a decade building. The report was factual. No dramatic accusations. No emotional language. Just dates, documents, login records, copies of my resignation, evidence that my credentials had continued to be used without my authorization. When I clicked submit, my hands were shaking. Not because I doubted the decision, because I knew what it would do to my family. It didn't take long. Mom called that same evening. Her voice was already raised before I even said hello. Did you actually report this? Yes. How could you do this to us? I didn't do this. You've embarrassed this family. No, Mom. I took a slow breath. I told you months ago I was no longer responsible." She didn't respond to that. Instead, she repeated the same thing. "Families handle problems privately." I looked around my quiet living room. I tried. She hung up. Ryan never called. Instead, the messages started coming from relatives. One cousin texted, "You could have handled this differently." An uncle wrote, "Your mother is devastated." Another simply said, "I hope this was worth it." Almost nobody asked whether the allegations were true. They only wanted to know why I hadn't kept protecting the family. If you've ever been blamed for refusing to carry someone else's mistake, let me know in the comments. Sometimes the hardest boundary is the one people never expected you to set. For a few days, I questioned everything. Then something unexpected happened. A former coworker named Jennifer called me during lunch. "I heard you've stepped away from the clinic." "I have." "Good." I laughed. "That's not the reaction I expected." "I'm serious." She paused. "You know how many independent clinics struggle with compliance?" "I have a pretty good idea. My medical group works with several of them." She hesitated. "I may have mentioned your name." "My name?" "They're looking for someone who actually understands regulations instead of just reacting to audits." A week later, I sat across from the administrator of a small family practice. He didn't ask about my family. He didn't ask why I'd left. He simply slid a stack of compliance reports across the table. "We've been trying to organize this for months." I looked through the files. "I can help." That became my first consulting client. It wasn't a huge contract, but it was mine. For the first time, someone was paying me for the work I'd been giving away for years. One client became two. Two became four. Every recommendation led to another introduction. Apparently, there were dozens of small clinics that needed exactly the kind of administrative systems I'd spent years building. The difference was simple. These people thanked me. They respected deadlines. When I sent recommendations, they followed them. Nobody acted like compliance was invisible work. One afternoon, Jennifer smiled after a meeting. "I told you there was a market for this. I spent 9 years thinking these skills were just family chores." She laughed. "Trust me. They're not." As my calendar slowly filled with new clients, bits of news about Brooks Family Clinic continued reaching me through mutual acquaintances. Insurance reimbursements were taking longer. Another inspection hadn't gone well. Cash flow was becoming a serious problem. For the first time since I walked away, people weren't talking about expansion anymore. They were talking about survival. Then, one of my former coworkers left me a voicemail. "Natalie, I don't know if you've heard what's happening over here." The concern in her voice told me this wasn't another small setback anymore. 3 years passed faster than I ever expected. Some weeks I was traveling to help independent clinics prepare for inspections. Other weeks I was training office managers on compliance systems they'd never had before. What started as one small consulting contract had quietly grown into a full business. I hired my first employee, then a second. Eventually, we were helping clinics across several states. The funny part? Almost every system we built was based on lessons I'd learned while trying to keep my family's clinic afloat. The difference was simple. These clients actually wanted to prevent problems before they happened. They listened, they planned, and they respected the work. One afternoon, after finishing a presentation, a physician shook my hand. "I don't think people realize how important compliance is." I smiled. "I've spent most of my career trying to explain exactly that." He laughed. "Well, you've convinced me." Comments like that still caught me off guard. For years, I'd worked behind the scenes without hearing a single thank you. Now people introduced me as an expert. Sometimes I still had to remind myself they were talking about me. I almost never thought about Brooks Family Clinic anymore. Not because I'd forgotten it, because I'd finally built a life that wasn't centered around fixing someone else's problems. Every now and then, I'd hear small updates through former employees or mutual friends. They'd lost another insurance contract. Patient numbers had dropped. Several longtime staff members had left. Ryan's expansion plans had quietly disappeared from every conversation. Nobody talked about opening a second location anymore. They were struggling to keep the first one alive. One Friday afternoon, Carol called. I hadn't heard from her in months. Hi, Nat. Hey, Carol. How are you? She hesitated. I wanted you to hear this from someone who cares about you. My heart sank. The clinic's being sold. I closed my office door before answering. Are you sure? The paperwork was finalized this morning. She sounded tired. Most of us found out at the staff meeting. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. That little clinic had been part of our community for decades. I'd spent almost 9 years trying to keep its doors open. Even after everything that happened, hearing those words hurt. I'm sorry, Carol whispered. So am I. A few weeks later, the community organized a small closing ceremony before the building officially changed hands. Local business owners came. Former patients stopped by. Retired nurses shared stories about working there years earlier. I almost didn't go. Then I realized something. I wasn't attending as part of the Brooks family. I was simply another member of the community saying goodbye to a place that had mattered. When I arrived, a few people recognized me, not because of my last name, because they'd worked with me professionally over the past few years. One former board member walked over and smiled. Natalie Brooks? It's good to see you. I've heard wonderful things about your consulting firm. We talked for a while before the conversation drifted toward the clinic. He shook his head. It's unfortunate. It is. Then he added something unexpected. You know, the investigation changed how a lot of people viewed what happened here. I looked at him. People finally understood who'd been keeping the administrative side together all those years. Another former employee joined us. I always wondered how everything ran so smoothly before. She smiled softly. Now I know. Word had spread much farther than I realized. The investigation records weren't gossip anymore. They'd become part of the clinic's history. For the first time, people weren't congratulating Ryan for his vision. They were thanking me for work they'd never seen. It felt strange, not satisfying, just honest. As the ceremony ended, several community leaders gathered near the entrance, quietly discussing what would happen to the property. One of them glanced toward me. I've heard your business is doing very well. Another smiled. If anyone can save this place, it's probably you. Within minutes, the same rumor spread through the crowd. Natalie's going to buy the clinic back. People kept looking in my direction, waiting for an announcement I hadn't made. I simply stood there, listening, knowing they had no idea what I'd already decided. People kept assuming I was going to buy the building. One person after another walked over during the reception. So, when are you taking it over? You could bring the clinic back. It would be a great full-circle moment. I smiled every time. I'm not buying it. Most of them looked surprised. A few even looked disappointed. I understood why. From the outside, it probably sounded like the perfect ending. The daughter everyone underestimated returns, saves the family clinic, and proves everyone wrong. Real life doesn't usually work that way. A few weeks later, I met with a local nonprofit that had been searching for a place to expand its community health programs. They offered free health screenings, nutrition education, family counseling, and help for people who struggle to understand insurance paperwork or apply for medical assistance. The more we talked, the more the idea made sense. Instead of rebuilding what had already failed, we could build something different. My company helped organize the compliance systems and administrative structure. The nonprofit handled the medical programs. Several local businesses donated furniture and equipment. Community volunteers painted walls that had desperately needed fresh color for years. Walking through the building during those renovations felt strange. Some rooms looked exactly the way I remembered them. Others had already become something completely new. One morning, Carol stopped by while volunteers were unloading supplies. She smiled when she saw me. "I like this version better." "So do I." She looked around the lobby. "It feels lighter somehow." I knew exactly what she meant. Nobody was arguing. Nobody was trying to impress anyone. People were simply working together. When the center officially opened, I stood near the entrance greeting visitors. Several former patients recognized me. One older gentleman slowly shook my hand. "I always wondered why things changed so much after you left." I wasn't sure how to answer. He smiled before I could say anything. "I'm just glad you're still helping people." A young mother thanked one of our volunteers for explaining her insurance forms. An elderly couple signed up for free health screenings. Teenagers came in for nutrition workshops after school. The building was busy again, just in a different way. That afternoon, I noticed my phone vibrating. "Mom." I let it ring once before answering. "Hi." Her voice sounded older than I remembered. "I heard about the community center." "Yeah. I'm glad the building is still helping people." There was an awkward silence. She cleared her throat. "I know things haven't been good between us." "No, they haven't." Another pause. "I was wondering if maybe we could have coffee sometime." Years ago, I would have heard that as the beginning of fixing everything. This time, it just sounded like an invitation. "I'll think about it," she quietly said. "Okay." Neither of us mentioned the investigation, or Ryan, or everything that happened. When the call ended, I didn't feel angry, but I also didn't feel like I owed anyone a faster answer than I was ready to give. A few months later, Ryan sent a short message. "Hope you're doing well." I read it. Then I replied, "I hope you are too." That was enough. We weren't pretending everything was normal. We weren't pretending nothing had happened. We were simply acknowledging each other's existence. For now, that was honest. Late one afternoon, after everyone else had gone home, I walked outside and looked back at the front of the building. The old clinic sign was gone. In its place was a new one: Community Health Resource Center. I stood there for a long time, not because I was thinking about what my family had lost, because I was looking at what hundreds of other families had gained. For years, I'd believed my value depended on how much I could sacrifice for people who barely noticed I was carrying the weight. I don't believe that anymore. The biggest victory wasn't watching Ryan's plans fall apart. It wasn't hearing people finally admit what I'd done behind the scenes. It wasn't even building a successful business. It was realizing I could use the same skills that once kept me trapped to help people who actually wanted the help. This place existed because of a choice I made, not because someone expected me to fix another emergency, not because I was trying to earn approval, just because I believed it was worth building. And somehow, that felt lighter than anything I'd carried during those 9 years. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself, I'm genuinely curious. What did you do? I'd love to read your story in the comments, because I know I'm probably not the only one who's had to learn that some boundaries come years later than they should.